In this video series, we're going to be having a look at the trope of sentient weapons and how these have been realized both in mythology and in game. Intelligent of varieties. Here we are looking at those kinds of weapons that reflect or embody the spirit of their owner in some fashion. It has been suggested by cognitive research that humans operating familiar tools perceive them as being an extension of the body in some way. So it should perhaps not be surprising that both myth and fiction are replete with such examples. This sword is spoken of. So the first sword we're going to talk about. So the first example I want to look at in mythology is Gram, the sword of the Volsungs. This sword is spoken of in the Volsunga saga. So it's introduced as originally driven into the great tree Barnstock or Barnstokkr by Odin, and only Sigmund, the Volsung, was capable of drawing it from the bark. When this blade was later used by Sigmund against a disguised Odin, the sword shattered and the warrior was slain by his enemies. It was later reclaimed by his son Sigurd, who had it reforged by Regan the dwarf. Naming the sword Gram, which means wrath, he immediately used it to slay Fafnir the dragon and shortly thereafter Regan himself. And it would later play a pivotal role in his downward spiral into self-destruction. Obviously, we've got a lot going on here, with the sword standing as a symbol for Odin's favor, the vitality of the wielder, the richness of the wielder's household, and later on, his temperament. Here, the direction of influence appears to be only one way. The wielder dictates the sword's identity and its use. So the idea that the sword has some kind of latent intelligence is not immediately obvious. However, I would argue that by defining the sword as an instrument of revenge and destruction, Sigurd sets into action a kind of positive feedback loop in which anger begets violence, which begets anger. This is a case of the person not just having an emotion, but the emotion having the person. Sigurd remakes Gram and repurposes it. Gram is then only used in acts of violent, prideful revenge. He's taken on an archetype, and he has become willfully possessed by it. The sword has been defined as an instrument of anger as much as Sigurd. Both of them are equally instruments of a higher power, that being wrath itself. So the second example we're going to take a look at are the blades of Sengo Muramasa. So this legend is a huge mess of various bits of historically attested events and pure fiction. The historical information is that once the Tokugawa shogunate was established, Tokugawa Ieyasu banned all swords forged by the Muramasa school, supposedly because too many of his folk had perished on them. And thus, the swords themselves became simultaneously reviled and prized, reviled by the shogun and his reviled by the shogun and his allies, but also prized by his enemies. So you'll see examples of Muramasa blades that have been altered or ground down to obfuscate the fact that Muramasa had forged them, or his school had forged them. So following this period, they featured in a lot of Japanese drama and fiction in the years since, and most famously with the legend that Muramasa was a student of the renowned swordsmith Masamune, and the legend it is the two smiths were separated by around 150 years. And according to this legend, the apprentice Muramasa was so hell-bent, if you'll pardon the pun, on being greater than his master, he forged weapons with deadly, bloodthirsty auras. Muramasa swords could cause warriors to cut themselves merely by inspecting them, inspire violence when drawn, and demanded that blood be shed before they could be sheathed. So here again, we have an example of a human's actions rubbing off on the sword. In contrast to the legend of Graham, the pride and ambition of Muramasa become a curse that affects not only the people in his family, but anyone who uses his creations. However, I believe there's an underlying similarity in that those who choose a Muramasa blade are doing so because they are walking a path similar to the sword's creator. If you are in the market for one of these weapons, it's obviously because you're willing to do whatever it takes to achieve your goals and eliminate your enemies. It's a Faustian bargain, dealing with demonic powers and being unable to bring about anything but the works of hell. Of this kind of weapon I want to talk about is one that's found in fiction, and specifically the sword I'm talking about is Gurthang, the black sword of Turin Turambar. Sindarin for Iron of Death. Now, Gurthang is Sindarin for Iron of Death, and in Tolkien's fiction, here we've got the clearest example of a blade becoming so tainted with violence that it begins to manifest an intellect both separate from and reflective of its wielder. The story of Turin is way too lengthy and poetic to recount here. You should either read the book or listen to this wonderful audio reading of it. I've linked it in the comments. However, I will say that it combines both an evil bladesmith, a traumatized young man, and a tragic tale of brutal violence. The protagonist takes up the most devastating sword he can find in a hopeless campaign of vengeance against what amounts to be Satan himself. Fighting evil becomes his sole ambition and becomes identified with his weapon to the point where people actually start calling him Black Sword rather than his real name. In the end, Turin is left alone and friendless, his whole family slain, and it's mostly due to his own choices and actions. Despite perceiving himself as a one-man army, this is a delusion in the face of the inherent interconnectedness between humans and their kin, and it is friends and relations that end up paying for his life of anger. He's basically become Homer in the Cartridge Family.
This gun cost me everything. My wife, my kids, everything but my precious, precious gun.
Finally, at the end of his frayed rope, he starts talking to his sole companion, the sword itself. And what is Gurthang's response? Well, what else could it be? Like him, the blade's sole motto has been live for revenge for most of the tale. So how is it that video games could impart the feeling or concept of a weapon that is an extension of the character or the player? Well, a seemingly obvious example of how games could evoke such a concept would be through the implementation of a crafting system. So I imagine the logic here would be that any game that allows you to create your own spin on a given weapon would allow you to dole out your own personal brand of violence. However, I'm not sure if such systems really achieve the effect that the aforementioned myths and stories get across. Again, we are looking for a system whereby there is a loop between the player controlling the weapon and the weapon controlling the player. The idea is that both weapon and wielder are involved in a relationship that neither has complete control of, and the only way to opt out would be to cast the sword aside. Games that have a fully customizable crafting system, or some such, put the player firmly in the driver's seat. The player gets everything they want, and there is no consequence or limitation imposed by making a particular weapon. Indeed, such systems are predicated on wish fulfillment and the idea that you get to be the author of your own experience. This is precisely the opposite of what we see happen with these myths, where the protagonist does not have control over the results of their actions. So far, I think a good example of a system that invokes a vicious relationship between the player or the character and the weapon would be that represented in the PlayStation classic Vagrant Story. While this game does have a crafting system, therein lies a single mechanic that makes all the difference. In the game, there are a variety of different kinds of creatures. Beast, human, dragon, undead, phantom, and evil are all enemy types that have various strengths and weaknesses. Whenever you deal damage to a creature, you slightly increase the damage that the weapon will deal to that enemy type in the future. The upshot of all this is that after hours of play, you have created a weapon that is designed to kill a certain creature type. However, this is brought about by the player's actions and not their whim or decree. When you come up against a powerful undead, it doesn't matter how strong other weapons might be, the weapon that you have trained to kill undead will likely be the best to combat it. The player is held responsible for the past actions that they have made in combat, and while the weapons can be reforged and upgraded, the core of the experience remains the same. The only problem with Vagrant Story is that it didn't really combine this amazing system with its brilliant narrative in any meaningful way. There was a causal relationship between Ashley Riot gaining spells upon recovering lost memories, but the weapon system wasn't employed to express any themes or concepts. The main example of such a weapon in our game is not that of Lewin, a being with its own independent personality, but that of Eidos herself. Eidos is the apparatus through which the player can interact with the world of Conscientia, and in this sense, she is a tool. However, Eidos' ability to affect the world is entirely decided by the player's choices of where they go and what they do. It is demonstrated in the dialogue system where a tyrannical statement cannot be followed up by a statement of intellectual curiosity. At this point, the player has chosen to present Eidos as a forceful instrument of will, a person not interested in absorbing new information. Such choices will ultimately affect the manner of abilities that she will gain access to, and access to these new abilities will remove other options. A good example of this would be the following scenario. The player has presented themselves in the world in such a way so that they have manifested a means to do violence, whether this be through techne or possessing the Lewin blade. Now, when encountering a strange or ambiguous situation, the player will have the option of combat. However, they will no longer be capable of retreat. Eidos has been shaped into an active force. While resolution of situations through dialogue or nonviolent techne may still be possible, inaction is a choice Eidos is no longer capable of making.